Time for sound design. In today's video, I'm going to show you how you can create variation when using a sample in electronic music. And the sample I'm going to use today is from a song called Raindrops, or in Dutch it's called Regendroppen by Johnny Hoes, the king of Dutch schlager music from the famous Telstar record label that he founded. And I'm going to use the intro of that song, which doesn't have any drums on it or bass, into an electronic track. The link to the original song is in the description. Let's get right into it. Let's go to Ableton and I'll play you the sample that I've used. So let's start with the sample. It sounds like this.
Regendroppen die aan je ven.
So this is the track from 1982. It's, as I said, schlager music. As you can see here in the sample, the intro has 4 bars before the singing and the drums, and the rest of the instrumentation comes in. And from those 4 bars, I'm going to use the first 2 bars only. And I'll play you now what I created with it. And so on. It goes on. I created an entire arrangement for a little over 3 minutes. And as you can see, there's a lot of different layers. So there's synths, there's bass, a lot of drums and percussion, effect sounds, textural sounds. In total, it says here, 31 layers. So what I want to do in this video is basically show you the different parts of the songs, because I used the same 2 bars from the beginning, but I used them in different ways to create variation in my track. So let's start with the first use of the sample in sort of the main part, or part 1 of the song. So what I did for the first part of the song, and you can see it here in white and also here again labeled with the marker 1. I just looped the first 2 bars. So the first 2 bars of the sample. As you can see here, I just put them for two bars, and then I made it mono. I did a low cut EQ, and yeah, that's it. That's it actually. So that sounds like this. And the tempo is at 121 BPM, so that's very recognizable as that is the sample. You just looped it. And at the end of 8 bars, I did a bit of glitching. So first reverse, then some repeating, and more repeating. As you can see if I zoom in here, and cut out some parts. So you get this nice 1 bar transition basically. And then I layered that with a bass, sub bass. So very basic, and then with the drums. So this is a nice way to use a sample, just a straight up loop, 2 bars. There's nothing complicated about this, but once you have this 8 bar loop and you add all your other elements, it's just that loop. So you want to create a B part, like a variation to this, and I didn't want to drop out the sample completely, because then you have to fill it up with something else and you kind of lose that vibe of the sample. So let me show you how I used it to create a variation. So as you can see, I color coded it here. For part 2, you have the yellow and the orange, and the yellow is basically the first bar of the sample, and the orange is the second bar of the sample. And then when I click on this, and I'll show you what I did, is that I used a quarter note from the first bar, and it used the 3rd quarter note, and I looped that. So that sounds like this. And I just looped it on the timeline, so I didn't put it into sampler or simpler. And because in the sample you can see that the volume is quite even, so there was no clicking. And I did that for the first 2 bars, and then for the second 2 bars I did the same trick but then with the second bar of the sample, also a quarter note. And if you then play that with the rest of the sounds, so basically you create a sort of a pad sound by looping a small section of the sample that is kind of even in volume, so you don't get click points or you don't get a fade or a fade in. But what I did to make it not boring is I changed the bass line a bit. So the bass line is doing more. You can see there's more notes in the bass line than before to kind of fill up some of the space. So it's still interesting to listen to. And I think this part really helps to contradict part one. So part one is more melodic. Let me play the last 4 bars of part one and the first 4 bars of part two. So you get a nice 2 parts. It's kind of balanced. 1 could be the main chorus and 2 is kind of the verse or sort of the less energetic version of the chorus. All right, so that's the first variation. Same sample, no additional effects, no other kinds of things going on. Just you take a different part of the loop and loop it in a different way. So after having part 1 and part 2, I wanted to create a bridge, so a part that is more different than part 1 and 2 to kind of break with what I have. And I decided that this part is only going to be 4 bars long, and I'm still using the same sample. So what I did is, as you can already see here, I only used the beginning of the sample of the first bar. And it's the same part throughout these 4 bars. So I use the first quarter note of the first bar of the sample. And that sounds like this. Since I only used the first part, I added a delay to this sound, a quarter note delay. So then with the delay, it feels like there is more than there actually is. And in this way, you really break with the continuous pattern that I had before for the first and the second part. And now there's much more air, much more space in the sound. I keep the same bass, so that sounds like this. Only on the first quarter note. But to kind of fill this up, I added a vocal sample, a very short vocal sample, kind of a hey sound with a delay and a reverb, redux and an auto pen. And that hits at the same time as the sample, so that sounds like this. And the vocal sample has a lot of space, so you really feel like it's very wide. And the delay on the vocal sample is actually on here 2, so they are 8 notes. Yeah. And then with the drums and the rest of the percussion. And then the other thing that I add for the first time in this track is a sampled instrument, and it's the guitar electric Dusty. And on its own, that sounds like this. So it's just like a little element, a little sparkle in there just to give it an extra texture. And then as you can see in the arrangement, it goes back to part 1. So then you get back into the regular looped sample. All right, so this was the third use of the same sample in a different way for a different part of my song. Now I have one more part in my song where I use the sample in a different way, and that's the actual break or the middle 8, where I kind of want something different and switch it up a little bit. So let me show you that part. So if you look at the arrangement here, you can see it's part 1, part 2, the bridge. Then it repeats it, part 1, part 2, the bridge, and then there's this break where I use the sample in a different way, and then it goes back to part 2, but with a variation, and later it goes into half tempo drums, but the sample will be used the same way throughout from there. Instead, to create more variation, I add instruments. So I add two synthesizers, and I take away the drums and put them back in. So then the variation doesn't come from the sample, but it comes from other instruments. But let's first focus on the break that's here. So as you can hear already, the sample is reversed. So if I switch off all the other layers, it sounds like this. And what I did here is that for the first bar, I used the first bar of the sample, but in reverse. And I use half a bar. And then the second bar here is the second bar of the sample in reverse, and I use half a bar of the sample looped, and I put it on a different track because the volume is lower here, and I use a reverb and a low cut EQ. So because it is the break, I want the sample to be a bit more in the background. That's why I try to wash it out a bit with reverb and put it lower in volume and take out the low end, and that's how you get this. And then when it gets back to part 2 here, the sample will be louder, so it will be a bigger sort of impact. So let me play you the last part of the break and then into part 2 when the beat comes back. And as you can see, for part 2, I introduced the drift synthesizer, the arpeggio, and I have the sample as a drone in the background. So yeah, that's how I use the same sample and the same first 2 bars of the sample in 4 different ways. So as for the main part, for the second part, for the bridge, and then also for the break. And in this way, you get a lot out of one sample. And of course, the good thing is that if you use one sample for different parts, there's a certain recognizability and consistency in your track without it getting bored. So that's the good thing about using the same sample, that it feels natural to go from one section to the other because you're still using the same sample, but with effects and chopping it up in a different way, looping it in a different way, reversing it, you still can create variation before having the need to add extra instruments or extra samples to it. As a fun thing, in the end, what I do is that I chop it up a little bit, add some effects, and then actually use a little bit of the original sample with a pitch shifter, as you can see here, this line. And it's almost like done in a recognizable way that if you would know this track, then at the end you would be like, okay, that's the sample used here. So let me play the end. I will play you at the end of this video the entire track so you can have a listen and see what you think about the different parts. Let me know in the comments how you use samples, how you create variation with samples. Do you add different samples? Do you have different techniques to use the same sample and create variation? As always, thanks for watching, keep making music, and see you in the next one.